Tonight, we're going to wander through some of the world's very first cities. Not the kind with skyscrapers, traffic jams, and overpriced oat milk lattes. I'm talking about the earliest clusters of bricks and mud, the experiments in urban living, where a few thousand people decided that huddling together was safer than getting eaten by something with sharp teeth. Of course, the irony is that these same cities were basically built in predator hotspots, because when you're trying to farm, you need rivers, and rivers are, inconveniently, where the lions, crocodiles, and hippos hang out. So, congratulations, ancient humans. You invented civilization and also gave apex predators a convenient buffet with brick walls around it. So tonight, dim the lights, relax your shoulders, and let's stroll slowly into the dusty streets of Uruk, Babylon, and the Nile towns of old. And while we're at it, let's appreciate the fact that our ancestors somehow made it through nights filled with roaring lions, snorting hippos, and the occasional crocodile casually sunning itself on the banks where you were just trying to do your laundry. Our first stop is Mesopotamia, that very poetic term that literally means between the rivers, specifically the Tigris and Euphrates. Two great waterways that gave us agriculture, irrigation, and also a lot of very grumpy predators. Uruk, often called the first true city, had walls so huge that later poets claimed they stretched for miles. People like Gilgamesh supposedly strutted along them, looking smug. But those walls weren't just built to impress neighboring towns. They were built because Mesopotamia had lions. Yes, actual lions, not just the metaphorical kind on family crests. Imagine trying to invent writing, scratching little wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, while knowing that outside your walls, a fully grown Asiatic lion is casually patrolling the reeds. It adds a certain urgency to your to-do list. And of course, kings of Mesopotamia were obsessed with lions. They turned lion hunting into a sort of PR campaign. Carvings show rulers bravely stabbing or shooting lions while attendants held the beasts by ropes, which, let's be honest, is the ancient equivalent of putting fearless adventurer in your Instagram bio after ziplining once on vacation. The reality was less noble. The lions were usually half-drugged or released into arenas so the king could perform the heroic kill in front of an audience. Still, the imagery mattered. Kings claimed that conquering lions proved they had divine favor, because if you can stab a lion in the neck, surely you can run an empire. History suggests not always. But step back for a moment. Why were lions even around Mesopotamian cities in the first place? The answer is simple. The land between the rivers was fertile. That meant deer, gazelles, wild boars, basically an all-you-can-eat buffet for carnivores. So while humans were busy domesticating wheat and barley, lions were domesticating the humans as nervous neighbors who provided steady prey. Let's not forget the wolves and leopards, too. Wolves prowled the edges of fields, happily stealing sheep. Leopards lurked in the reeds, ready to ruin someone's day. And if you wandered too close to the marshes, congratulations, you just made yourself a potential crocodile snack. So Mesopotamian cities weren't just centers of trade and writing and beer brewing. They were also experiments in how many walls it takes to keep nature out. Spoiler, it took a lot. By the time we get to Babylon, the cities are grander, but the predator problem hasn't gone away. In fact, it has become part of the city's identity. Babylonian art is filled with lions, striding along glazed brick walls, roaring on temple gates. The famous Ishtar Gate, covered in lions. It's almost like the Babylonians were saying, yes, we live with these things outside our walls, but look, we've turned them into art. The ultimate flex. We fear them so much, we decorated with them. But here's the thing. Lions weren't just out in the wild. They were brought into cities for rituals. Caged, paraded, sacrificed. Because what better way to show control than dragging the apex predator of your region into town square and making it dance to your drumbeat? You can picture a Babylonian citizen lying in bed at night, not in a comfy mattress, you mind, but on a reed mat, hearing both the howl of wolves outside the city and the roar of a lion that some priest is locked up for tomorrow's ceremony. Sweet dreams indeed. Now, if lions weren't bad enough, South Mesopotamia had another issue: riverside predators. Crocodiles were rare but present, especially closer towards the marshlands of the Persian Gulf. Imagine drawing water and seeing two yellow eyes just above the surface. Unlike lions, crocodiles didn't become royal PR. They were more like an unspoken hazard. No one was bragging about wrestling them for glory, mostly because wrestling a crocodile usually ended one way, with fewer limbs. It's one of those details that reminds you ancient cities weren't safe zones. They were just slightly less unsafe zones surrounded by creatures that saw no reason to respect the concept of human progress. And honestly, that's the hilarious tragedy of these early cities. Humans invented irrigation canals, writing systems, trade networks, but they still had to keep an eye on the shadows outside the torchlight. Every proud royal inscription about ruling the world was undercut by the simple fact that outside the walls, the world still belonged to lions and crocodiles. Civilization, meet predator. Predator, meet buffet. Now, let's float down the rivers and across the desert to Egypt. Because if you think Mesopotamians had predator problems, wait until you see what happens when your local river god has the head of a crocodile. That's not symbolism. That's trauma turned into religion.
So here we are, drifting into Egypt, the land of pyramids, eyeliner sharp enough to kill a man, and, most importantly for our theme tonight, predators that made daily life feel like a survival game. See, the Egyptians did what every smart ancient civilization did. They built their entire life around a river. The Nile was everything: transport, farmland, drinking water, and probably the best excuse in history for inventing boats. But here's the problem. The Nile was already rented out by crocodiles and hippos. Let's start with the crocodiles. If Mesopotamians treated lions as the big scary neighbors, Egyptians went a step further and gave their crocodiles a god, Sobek. Crocodile-headed, grinning, scales and all. Now, calling crocodiles divine might sound noble, but really it was a very practical arrangement. You couldn't get rid of them, so you made peace. If one ate your uncle, well, he was chosen by Sobek, which sounds a lot better than he was dragged underwater while filling a bucket. Temples actually kept live crocodiles. They fed them, pampered them, even decorated them with jewelry. Yes, ancient Egypt invented reptile bling. Imagine walking into a holy sanctuary and seeing a croc lounging in the corner with gold bracelets on its legs. That's not piety. That's bribery disguised as religion. And the psychology is pretty transparent. If you treat the predator as a god, maybe it spares you. If not, at least the priests can explain your death as part of a cosmic plan. Either way, civilization keeps running. And then we have hippos. Modern people think of them as funny, chunky animals. Kids read about them in picture books. Egyptians had no such illusions. Hippos were chaos incarnate. They ate crops, capsized boats, and crushed unlucky farmers. Pharaohs linked them to Set, the god of disorder, storms, and general bad vibes. Which makes sense, because when a 3-ton hippo charges your fishing boat, bad vibes is putting it mildly. Hunting hippos became a royal pastime. Tomb walls show pharaohs standing proudly in papyrus boats throwing harpoons at them. The symbolism was obvious: order conquering chaos. But let's be real. The pharaoh did the easy part. His attendants were the ones frantically paddling while a massive hippo tried to bite the boat in half. You don't see that part on the walls. For ordinary Egyptians, the situation was simpler. You had no choice. The Nile gave you life, so you worked your fields, fished its waters, and prayed that Sobek or Set looked elsewhere when you bent down for water. Imagine going to bed at night. Your house is mud brick, your lamp is flickering, and outside in the reeds, there's a sound. Something big shifting its weight. Could be a cow, could be a hippo, could be the last sound you hear. And yet, the Nile still held them. People didn't abandon it. They couldn't. They simply built a civilization in a place where monsters came with the package deal. Egypt is often portrayed as serene, pyramids glowing in the sun, lotus flowers floating on the water, calm music playing in documentaries. But the reality was different. It was one of the only places in history where you built your cities knowing full well your main god might eat you while you washed your laundry. And somehow, people just accepted it, because humans are great at ignoring the obvious. As long as the harvest came in and the temples stayed shiny, life went on. Now, let's drift further east, because while the Egyptians were busy bribing crocodiles with jewelry, the people of the Indus Valley were living in tidy cities with straight streets, indoor plumbing, and tigers. Because of course they were. And if you think lions and crocodiles were bad, wait until you hear what happens when your urban planning masterpiece sits in the middle of leopard country.
So now we arrive in the Indus Valley. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, cities so neatly laid out that they make some modern neighborhoods look like complete chaos. Straight streets, drainage systems, even public baths. Everything orderly, measured, civilized. But here's the funny thing. All that tidy brickwork was surrounded by some of the least tidy neighbors imaginable, because the Indus Valley was predator country, and not the kind you could just wall out. First up, tigers. Big, striped, and more than happy to snack on livestock or people if the opportunity presented itself. You can almost hear it. The cough of a tiger in the night, carrying over the flat plains. Not exactly the soundscape you want while walking home with your grain basket. Then there were leopards. Smaller than tigers, but sneakier. Silent, climbing, ambush-loving cats that didn't need to roar to terrify. The Indus Valley might have been an urban marvel, but at night, those oil lamps didn't reach very far. The edges of the city were shadows, and shadows belonged to leopards. And if big cats weren't enough, let's talk about elephants. Today, elephants carry this aura of wise majesty. Back then, they were wild, untamed, and occasionally very angry. An elephant wandering into your fields was not a magical Disney moment. It was the end of your harvest, and possibly the end of you if you got in the way. Indus seals often depict elephants, carved in neat, stylized outlines. But you get the sense these weren't purely decorative. They were reminders. Symbols of strength, yes, but also warnings of what lived right outside the city's borders. And then there were the aurochs. Now extinct, these were massive wild cattle. Think modern bulls, but bigger, stronger, and with the temperament of a tank that resents your existence. People eventually domesticated their descendants into modern cattle, but at the time, they were just enormous, horned beasts wandering near human settlements, occasionally reminding everyone that civilization was still one bad decision away from disaster. What's remarkable about the Indus cities is how clean and ordered they were. Grid systems, sewage drains, public wells. People who lived there cared about hygiene, planning, and civic life. And yet, outside the edges of those carefully measured streets, nature was chaos. Predators prowled, elephants trampled, aurochs snorted. It's almost poetic. The Indus Valley gave us some of humanity's most advanced early cities, then surrounded them with animals that treated walls as mild suggestions. Just like in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the predators found their way into Indus culture. Their seals show tigers, elephants, bulls, and mysterious horned figures. Some scholars argue these were deities. Others say they were symbolic of power, fertility, or chaos. But either way, the message was clear. The predators weren't just background noise. They were part of how people explained the world. Because when you live in a city where you can hear a tiger's cough outside the walls, you don't pretend predators don't exist. You carve them into your art, your faith, your sense of reality. That's how you make sense of being civilized in a place that's anything but safe. So far, we've seen Mesopotamia wrestle with lions, Egypt bow to crocodiles, and the Indus Valley engineer neat little grids in tiger country. You'd think humans might learn to build cities in slightly less terrifying locations, but no. Instead, as we move into Greece and Rome, we find people not only living among predators, but actively dragging predators into the center of the city. Because nothing says we're in control now like turning the Colosseum into a part-time zoo filled with lions, leopards, bears, and the occasional crocodile.
So far, we've seen early cities doing everything they can to avoid being eaten. Walls, temples, rituals, bribing crocodiles with jewelry. But then we hit the Greeks and Romans, and suddenly the logic flips. Instead of keeping predators out, they start dragging them in. Because of course they did. When your empire spans continents and you've convinced yourself you're masters of the world, why not import lions, leopards, and bears to prove it? Nothing says civilized like turning your city into a live-action nature documentary, minus the happy ending for the animals. Let's start with the Greeks. Their cities weren't exactly predator-free either. Wolves prowled the hills of Attica. Shepherds lost sheep constantly, which is partly why wolves show up so often in Greek myth and fable. They weren't just stories for kids. They were warnings wrapped in allegory. The Greeks didn't worship wolves the way Egyptians worshipped crocodiles, but they respected them enough to fold them into their myths. Zeus himself had a wolfish aspect in some traditions. And then there was Lycaon, the unfortunate king who supposedly fed Zeus human flesh and got turned into a wolf, which is one way of saying, if you cross the gods, you get demoted to predator status. But the Greek cities didn't turn predators into gods to appease them. They turned them into metaphors. Wolves became the shorthand for wildness, danger, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. The predators were real, but their symbolic value mattered just as much. Now, Rome. Rome took things to a whole new level. The Romans didn't just fear predators, they franchised them. Picture the Colosseum. 50,000 spectators, stone arches towering, and at the center, not just gladiators, but cages. Inside, lions, leopards, crocodiles, even the occasional rhinoceros. Because what better way to celebrate empire than by dragging exotic predators from conquered lands and showing them off to the crowd? It was part entertainment, part propaganda. Rome wasn't just saying, "We rule people." It was saying, "We rule nature itself." The morning shows often featured venetines, beast hunts. Hunters armed with spears or bows would fight lions, leopards, or bears while the crowd cheered. Sometimes it was staged hunts, with scenery set up to mimic forests or deserts. Sometimes it was just raw slaughter, hundreds of animals killed in a single day. Of course, behind the bravado, it was messy. Some hunters died, some predators escaped their cages. Imagine sitting in the stands, happily munching on whatever the Roman equivalent of popcorn was, when suddenly a panther leaps into the crowd. That's the kind of audience participation no one wanted. And here's the wild part.
Rome wasn't naturally filled with lions or crocodiles. Italy had wolves and bears, sure, but lions? Those came from Africa and the Middle East, leopards from Asia, elephants from as far as India. They were shipped across seas, hauled into cities, and paraded in triumphs before being sent to the arena. The logistics alone are staggering. Imagine being the Roman official responsible for making sure a batch of lions survived the boat trip from North Africa. One wrong move, and congratulations, your dinner before you even hit port. But the Romans kept doing it. Because predators weren't just animals, they were political theater. A lion killed in the arena was a symbol. Rome had conquered wild nature. An elephant speared in front of a cheering crowd, proof that empire had no limits. And then, of course, there's Rome's founding myth. Romulus and Remus, twin infants, abandoned, suckled by a she-wolf until they grew into the city's founders. Whether or not you believe it, the imagery is telling. The Romans defined themselves as children of a predator. Civilization born from fangs and milk. So while Mesopotamians carved lions into reliefs and Egyptians gave crocodiles temples, the Romans made predators part of their very identity. Half mascot, half prisoner, half symbol of global dominance. Yes, that's three halves, but Rome always did like to exaggerate. Think about it. Cities were originally about protection. Walls, gates, moats, all to keep the predators out. But in Rome, the ultimate symbol of civilization was to build the biggest arena possible and invite the predators back in, on purpose, for fun. It's almost too perfect an irony. Humans finally build safe spaces and then decide safety is boring. Bring in the lions. Of course, Rome eventually fell. The Colosseum crumbled, the empire's grip slipped. But predators didn't disappear. Far from it. In medieval Europe, cities once again became islands of light in seas of darkness. And outside those walls, wolves. Lots and lots of wolves. So many, in fact, that they'd eventually inspire fairy tales, fables, and centuries of paranoia. Because nothing keeps you up at night like a pack of hungry wolves circling your village. But that's a story for the next stretch of our sleepy walk. So Rome collapses. The arenas go quiet. No more parading elephants through the streets. No more caged lions dragged into the public eye. But don't worry, predators didn't exactly go away. They simply reclaimed the shadows. And for medieval Europe, those shadows were never far. Picture Paris, not as a glittering city of lights, but as a smoky, cramped medieval town. Narrow alleys, wooden houses, and just beyond the walls, forests stretching into darkness. And in those forests, wolves. Lots of wolves. Wolves were the constant backdrop of medieval life. Farmers feared them. Shepherds fought them. Sometimes they came right up to the city gates. There are records of wolves prowling inside Paris itself during harsh winters, bold enough to drag bodies from graveyards when food was scarce. That's not fairy tale stuff. That's Tuesday night in the 1400s. The infamous Courtauld wolves of Paris in the 1450s supposedly killed dozens of people. Locals finally banded together to hunt them down in the streets. Imagine that. One of Europe's greatest cities, reduced to organizing a wolf hunt on its own boulevards. Not exactly the image of a safe urban paradise. And this is why wolves loom so large in European folklore. Little Red Riding Hood, the Three Little Pigs, all those dark forest stories. They weren't just children's fables. They were cautionary tales rooted in reality. Parents weren't just saying, "Don't talk to strangers." They were saying, "Don't wander outside the walls at dusk unless you'd like to meet the actual wolf pack waiting in the tree line." It's telling that in medieval art and story, wolves became shorthand for chaos, the ever-present threat just outside civilization's glow. Exactly like lions for Mesopotamia or crocodiles for Egypt. Different predator, same fear. Wolves weren't alone. Bears roamed Europe's forests, occasionally making themselves unwelcome visitors in farmlands and villages. And then there were wild boars. If you've never thought of a pig as terrifying, you've never met a medieval boar. Tusks sharp enough to gut a horse, tempers short enough to start a fight with anything. Hunting boars became a noble pastime, not just because they were dangerous, but because killing one made you look brave. Or foolish, depending on how it ended. For medieval towns, predators weren't imported props like in Rome. They were part of the landscape, woven into daily anxiety. Go too far into the forest, and you might not come back. Simple as that. Now, let's cross the ocean, because while Europe was howling with wolves, the Americas had their own predator problems. Take the Mayan cities, rising out of the jungles of Central America. Towering temples, bustling plazas, and just beyond the walls, jaguars. Stealthy, powerful, night-stalking cats that could take down deer, tapirs, even people if they felt bold. The jaguar wasn't just an animal to the Maya and Aztecs. It was a god, a symbol of royalty and ferocity. Kings wore jaguar skins. Warriors were called jaguar knights. But beneath the reverence was fear. Because if you walked too far into the jungle, the god might stop being symbolic and start being very literal. And then there were crocodiles, lounging in the sacred lakes and rivers. Aztec myths spoke of Cipactli, a great crocodilian monster from which the earth itself was made. It's easy to see why. If the Nile inspired Sobek, the lakes of Mexico did the same for Cipactli. You see enough crocodiles in murky water, you're going to start writing them into your creation stories. From Paris to Tenochtitlan, medieval and New World cities shared the same uneasy truth. Predators weren't gone. They circled the edges of human light, howling, growling, waiting. Sometimes they were fought. Sometimes they were worshipped. But they were never fully gone. Civilization had grown. Walls had risen. Churches and temples scraped the sky. But on the other side of the gate, the wild still pressed its face against the bars. And here's the quiet irony. As humans spread, predators retreated. Bit by bit, wolves were hunted to near extinction in Western Europe. Bears vanished from most lowlands. Jaguars pulled back deeper into jungles. Hippos and crocodiles gave up their stretches of river. Today, most cities feel predator-free. But for thousands of years, cities were never sealed bubbles of safety. They were glowing islands in seas of fangs and claws. And that brings us to our final stretch. Let's gently wind down and look back at this whole strange journey, from Mesopotamia's lions to medieval wolves, from Sobek's temples to Aztec jaguar knights. Because at the end of the day, the story of cities is also the story of predators.
Now at the end of our little midnight walk through history, we've wandered past the lions of Mesopotamia, the jeweled crocodiles of Egypt, the striped shadows of the Indus, the wolf-haunted streets of medieval Europe, and the jaguar temples of the New World. And if you're thinking, wow, humanity built cities in the worst possible places, you're not wrong. It's almost like we couldn't help ourselves. Because the truth is, civilization was never about escaping predators. It was about living with them, or pretending we could. Think of those early walls in Uruk. So proud, so massive. Kings inscribed their names, poets sang of their strength.
And yet, on the other side of the bricks, lions still prowled the reeds, unimpressed by royal titles. Or picture the Nile temples glistening in sunlight, while a crocodile slid silently into the water, reminding every farmer who was really in charge. Cities were little bubbles of light. The wild pressed against them like a tide. Sometimes the tide got in. Over time, the predators faded into symbols. Lions became heraldry. Crocodiles became gods in dusty papyrus texts. Wolves became fairy tales. Jaguars became carved in stone, staring with eternal eyes. Humans have this funny habit. When we can't fight something, we mythologize it, turn it into a story, a warning, or a god to bargain with. It's easier to sleep at night if the thing with teeth has a name. And of course, the great irony is that as we expanded, the predators retreated. We hunted, fenced, built, and paved until the wolves no longer prowled Paris. The aurochs were gone, and jaguars kept to shrinking jungles. Now, most of us live in cities where the scariest nighttime encounter is a raccoon in the trash. But for most of human history, cities were never sealed fortresses. They were experiments in survival. Temporary shelters carved into a world that still belonged to something bigger, faster, sharper. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember that the quiet safety of your city, your streetlights, your locked doors, it's a very recent gift. For thousands of years, humans lay down at night with the sound of predators just beyond the walls. Growls in the reeds, howls in the forest, eyes glinting in the firelight. Civilization was never built apart from predators. It was built in their world, a fragile dream balanced on the edge of teeth and claw. And maybe, just maybe, that's why our stories are still full of wolves and monsters in the dark. Because deep down, we remember. So close your eyes now. Let the howls and roars of the past fade into whispers. The predators are gone from your walls tonight. The city is yours. The world is quiet. And the long night wakes, soft and safe for your dreams.